You're very welcome to the final Talking Towns of the academic year, and it's brought to you by the Centre for Irish Towns in UCD. Just in case anyone is not muted when you come in, if I can ask you just to make sure that you remain muted throughout, and we'll give in some detail later on about how you can ask questions and engage later on in the presentation. So CFIT was founded by Orla Byrne and Philip Crowe to bring together researchers and stakeholders from across the island of Ireland to support the revitalisation of Irish towns. So my name is Sarah Cotterill, and I'm an assistant professor in the School of Civil Engineering and a member of CFIT's working group, and I'm delighted to be chairing today's webinar. So the focus of today is the transformation of life and work in towns. And we have 3 speakers for you before we open up the discussion. So please put any questions or comments that you have into the chat, and preferably as well the name of the person that the question is for. And then I'll try to get through as many of these as we can in the Q&A at the end after we've heard all 3 speakers talk. So the final thing to note is that we are recording this, and we will post it to CFIT's YouTube channel. You can catch up on any of the previous seminars that we've run this year there, and I'll drop a link into the chat after this as well so that you can access that. So the first speaker today is Dr. Orla Byrne. She's an assistant professor in the UCD College of Business, and her research focuses on the lived experiences of entrepreneurship. So that's both in terms of the practices that underpin the day-to-day events and the ways in which entrepreneurs are affected by and respond to significant challenges. So this has led to work on business failure and the recovery of entrepreneurs, as well as the resilience of entrepreneurs and their businesses during COVID-19. So Orla's talk today will focus on overcoming challenges of small businesses.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm just going to share now. Hopefully you can see that. Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for the introduction, and thank you, CFIT, indeed, for the invitation to talk today. I've just learned over this year about CFIT and been happy to help out or to get involved and find out more about the work that you're doing as well. So today my talk is really looking at small businesses, and I hope celebrating small businesses in ways as well. Yeah, to begin with, I just wanted to present some context. You know, why would we bother talking about small businesses? Why would we single them out? What's so important about them? Well, I think they're very important for starters, and everybody else in this space does as well. So SMEs, or small to medium-sized enterprises, they play such a significant role in all of our economies, not just in Ireland, but across the world as well. So they, when we're talking about SMEs, we're typically talking about less than 50 employees, and the majority of these businesses in Ireland are indeed actually micro businesses which employ up to 10 employees. So we're talking about small operations that on an individual level might seem maybe a little bit insignificant, but collectively they are huge pillars of all economies and societies in terms of employment in particular. And we have some statistics here. This is information drawn from Small Firms Association and OECD more broadly as well. But we're looking at about 250,000 of businesses, and these businesses are in every town, village, city in the country, and they employ a huge number of people, so employ up to 700,000 people, or 50% of the workforce, the private sector workforce. And in some counties as well, that's even higher. It's up to 60% of the private sector workforce. So these are areas where we're not getting foreign direct investment, we're not getting large multinationals, we're not getting large businesses, but instead we're dependent on small scale enterprises in those areas to provide local employment, and on a firm level what they can, so that's in terms of their contribution to the kind of bigger picture side of things. But on a firm level, we know these businesses, they're innovative, they're creative, they're niche, and they're from root level, so they're from the ground up, so they cater for local needs, wants and demands as well, and so have a good fit with their local economies, and they're independent also. And all of these things, if we've an array of these types of business, we have more interesting texture, tapestry to our towns as well, and that provide an independent stamp or an identity of a town, more so than the chains and businesses that you might see in across all countries. And then in terms of some challenges that they face on a kind of a firm level, because they are small, then that's part of their beauty. It also means that they're more vulnerable. So that can affect their access to resources. It can affect things like their legitimization when they're starting up. The startup process can be quite difficult. And then these limited resources and limited access to resources can impede sometimes their growth and survival, and their overall potential. So that's a little bit of understanding about what these small businesses are. And then the talk today I'm going to talk about is overcoming challenges, but let's just take a moment to understand, well, what challenges we're talking about. So we've addressed some of the firm level challenges that they face, but on a macro level, the challenges have been, I would say, pretty brutal over the last 10 or more years. So let's take us back to 2008 to 2014. It was a difficult time for many people and for most people in the country, but for small businesses in particular, it was particularly grueling. So we saw the startup levels fall, the lure of self-employment, of entrepreneurship certainly wasn't there for some, or for some indeed, they were pushed into necessity entrepreneurship, where starting a business was perhaps the only option when there were such high levels of unemployment. Across the world, in terms of the US, the impact of the financial crisis on small businesses was being studied as well. We saw a contraction of our economies as a whole, and definitely we saw the impact this was having in terms of bankruptcies and closures in this sector as well. Then things started to pick up a bit around 2014, 2015, and the horizon was looking like it was going to be somewhat rosy. And then in 2016, there was another big surprise for business owners, and that came, of course, in the shape of Brexit. So this was one that wasn't so easily predicted, but was an absolute shock for many small business owners, especially those for whom they were dependent on the closest trading partner, used Britain as a land bridge. Any fresh produce fresh product producers were now having to look at alternative markets and see for perishable goods how realistic the wider European market was going to be. So we could see that this was another challenge, massive macro challenge. And again, there was government support there to try to help people diversify and also work on their supply chains, etc. So anyone who came out of that Brexit period, which went on for longer than anyone expected. Then, of course, in 2020, things were looking rosy once again, with Brexit somewhat under control, figured out our various routes. And then, lo and behold, we were hit with the global pandemic. And we all remember, I'm sure, Leo Varadkar on the steps in Washington telling us that news. And for all of us, our lives changed immediately as a result of the various lockdowns and restrictions that were implemented. But for businesses, this was their livelihood, this was their business. And one of the headlines there says that the 60% of Irish businesses were negatively impacted by COVID. And for many, 60% of or more of their business was just wiped out overnight. And those businesses were taking a long time to get back on their feet. And I suppose 2021, 2022, coming into 2022 looked like it was going to be somewhat positive again. There was further studies on growth expectations, etc., and recruitment expectations in this sector, and it was quite optimistic. And then, of course, at the start of this year, things took another shock. So this has been a dreadful time, obviously, for people in these countries, in Ukraine in particular. And we're all going to feel the impact of this in terms of cost of living, etc. But once again, for small businesses who are trying to keep going on a daily basis, the rising cost of keeping businesses going we're going to see a lot more suffering in that sector too. These are the kind of significant challenges that we're seeing small businesses having to face on a daily basis in response to macro challenges that are out there. So in terms of overcoming these challenges, from my research with entrepreneurs, speaking to entrepreneurs over the years, and we did an extensive study of entrepreneurs in Ireland, the UK, and in Italy as well. Overcoming challenges, I see there's been three significant contributors. And the first is the entrepreneur, the business owner themselves, what they can actually do and is within their own power. And what we've seen is that creative leadership and management skills cannot be overlooked. So this materializes in terms of quick decision making. So the ability to just make a decision, as one entrepreneur said to me, any decision is better than no decision in this kind of context, because time is money. So when these events, these massive shocks occur, you've no time to do your usual crosses and checks, etc. You have to just go with your gut instinct. And that comes down to turning problems into opportunities, trying to find those solutions. And during this process, as you're trying to figure out what to do and how to steer the ship, you're trying to keep those communication channels open and transparency with your workforce across the team as well, to put them at ease as much as possible and keep them informed and in the loop. So maintaining that kind of team culture within an organization, within the business, can be important as well. And then this review and analysis of resources and how, for example, existing supply chains or resources can be used or flipped or redeployed into wherever the opportunities are that may be arising even from the external shock that you're going through. And then there's the usual things in terms of managing finance. And we've seen a range of these being employed by business owners across the board. But either the leadership side or the finance side isn't enough on its own. It's a combination of the two. But also what we've seen is that from one crisis to another, one shock to another, that entrepreneurs and business owners certainly build up resilience. And resilience is this ability to cope with adversity. And unfortunately, the only way we can develop that resilience is by facing and going through adversity itself. So adversities can be small or they can be large, but when they're large, it's our ability to have gone through previous adversities that then presents us in a good opportunity to face new ones as they arise as well. So a lot of pressure on the business owner to drive things. The second kind of side of this would be the policy and infrastructure surrounding the entrepreneur, the business owner, and their business. And it's a big sector, but they're small individual parties. So therefore they need a strong collective voice lobbying on their behalf. And the stronger and more powerful that collective voice is, then each individual can be represented and feel confidence that their needs are being heard and being addressed. So it's very important for government to listen to these lobby groups, the Small Firms Association, for IBEC for the larger employers, etc. That we then also need and request and require a strong and rapid government response to these challenges. And entrepreneurs were quite favourable in terms of the COVID responses in the initial phase. I'm sure by lockdown 3, had we gone back, we actually went back to some of them in lockdown 3, and they were fairly weary of the whole thing, and as we all were. But this joined up thinking is really important, and overall reducing the regulatory burden on small businesses as well. Their time is limited, their resources are limited. It can't make this more complex and overburdensome or overburdened as an already exhausted resource. And the community support is really important as well. So there's been lots of great initiatives that have come out, especially over the last 2 years, and in terms of providing infrastructure and support for people to remain in local areas is only good for local small businesses as well. They've got greater access to workforce, with greater access to skills, to knowledge, and also it creates this culture of providing role models in local areas and making it more of a viable career option for people to stay in their local areas, start up businesses, because the facilities and infrastructure is actually there. And the last pillar of all of this is us we all have an important role to play in terms of how we support small businesses. So for €10 we spend on Irish products, we can generate more than €40 of benefit to the local community. We all have a decision, we've all got limited buying power, which is just reducing daily with the cost of living increasing, but we still make decisions on a daily basis as to how we spend our money. It's important to be price conscious. But there's no point in liking, in terms of identifying a nice local shop or a nice local product that's really nice and then saying, oh, it's a shame that went out of business, because we all can be in the position where if we don't make those purchases, those businesses will suffer and indeed close. So the responsibility on all of us to be more aware, and I would say kind of support and promote local businesses where we can. And that's pretty much it. I think I've tried to keep within time, Sarah, and welcome any questions towards the end.
Fantastic, thanks Orla. So as I mentioned, if you can drop any questions that you have for Orla into the chat, we are going to move on to our next speaker, but I just thought it was fascinating how large the proportion of the workforce in many of the counties across Ireland actually come from those small businesses. And as you say, everyone has a role to play in terms of shaping our towns, the types of businesses that we see within there, and the types of businesses that we might want to support. So I think this is going to tie in really well with the next two speakers that we have, and I think this is going to create a really interesting discussion around how these businesses can be resilient to the many crises they've faced over the past few years, and where innovation has come from that in terms of the way in which we work and shape our towns. So we're going to move on to our next speaker now. The next talk is from John Evoy, who is the General Manager at Remote Grow. And prior to this, he was a Senior Fund Manager at Rethink Ireland and founder of Irish Men's Shed Association. He's won numerous awards for his work with men's sheds and other community development and social entrepreneurship, including an Irish People of the Year award in 2015. So John's going to talk to us about remote working and how this can be a key component for developing town centres within Ireland.
Okay, hello, thanks very much, Sarah. Hello, everybody. It's really nice to be here and have this opportunity. I've just shared my screen as well, and I hope you can all see that. Yeah, and thanks, Orla. That was fascinating, and I think very relevant. And again, I was surprised just at the sheer numbers of people who worked in SMEs and how such a critical part of our economy and society that SMEs are, and that they mightn't get the due attention they deserve. I believe, I suppose, and it's my job to believe as well, that remote workers and the potential of remote work to help transform our regional towns, small towns and villages is also underestimated. And so that's what we do at Grow Remote. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Grow Remote and our organization and what we do and the change we're trying to bring about in the world and how we're going about that. And in particular, I suppose, how we can positively affect like the social and economic development of smaller towns and like our rural and regional areas. And again, like if there's any questions, pop them in the chat. And again, I'll try and keep this to the time allocated. So we're at Grow Remote, we're a young social enterprise, we're a non-profit, and our mission is to make remote work local by making it visible and accessible. So to do that, we believe that we need to build out the entire ecosystem. There's not there's quite relative to other countries, there's quite a good remote working ecosystem in Ireland, but relative to other sectors such as maybe the startup sector, for example, or the FDI, foreign direct investment, and so on, it really is an underdeveloped sector compared to the potential it has to transform our country. So we have lots of facets to our work, but very briefly, we work with communities, companies, and individuals to try and tackle this from all angles. From communities, we primarily have what we call chapters. They're groups of remote workers who come together to counteract the first kind of problem we tried to solve when remote working was started to be a thing. And this was pre-pandemic. And of course, we know now that the pandemic has totally transformed like remote working as a thing in Ireland. And a few years ago, it was kind of oh, what's that? Would it really work? Is it a scam? Can you really live at home and work on your computer and get paid? And now that's obviously very, very different. So back in the pre-pandemic, the first problem was that there's lots of remote workers in Ireland that were very hidden and they were kind of isolated. So we set up local community groups. We call them chapters, where remote workers came together offline, you know, to do activities together. It could have been just to meet up for a coffee. It could have been, you know, to, after a while, when it got a little bit more organized, maybe have a speaker come in on a certain topic or so on. It could be to do with the tools and resources you can do, you can use to make you a better remote worker and so on. So there's over 130 of those groups now. About half of that number are in Ireland, about 70 odd, and the other 70 are in other countries. Now, forgive me, I'll be jumping back an edge a little bit chronologically, but you know, but when the pandemic came, obviously all the offline activity had to stop, so those chapters also stopped. So now they're just cranking up again, and it's interesting because the remote work and kind of landscape has changed so dramatically. The chapters are even changed, you know, they have different needs. There's a lot more remote workers around. We don't have to do the tasks like demystifying remote work because a lot of people know an awful lot about it. From working with an individual's perspective, we offer a lot of training, particularly in partnership with the ETBs, the IDA and Solace. And we were looking at the population that may have been unemployed or underemployed. So we designed training courses in skills for remote work, you know, as just, and they're fully funded and freely available to anybody all over the country. But we also work with companies, and one of the key things we do there is also offer training in leading remote teams. I might come back to that later, because companies, SMEs or large companies who are transitioning to a remote workforce face plenty of challenges. And one of them in particular is for their leaders or people managers. But I don't want to digress too much. I suppose, again, this is just, I suppose, a slide to say that, like, we really firmly believe that, like, when remote working is done well, it can help, like, people can live and work wherever they want. Really good for, like, economies, you know, rural and regional economies that might have been experiencing, you know, the effects of urbanization over the last number of decades. And you know, having people who live and work and spend their money locally and spend their spare time locally in the smaller town and villages is really transformative. We know that for every 3 remote jobs where people live and work and spend their money locally, that sustains at least another 2 jobs locally, whether that's in the local spa or coffee shops and so on. And that is really the ripple effect that we're talking about, and how remote work can help revitalize town centers and, you know, start to get activity back in a lot of those buildings that we see in all the small towns and the main streets in all the small towns in the country that unfortunately have not been going on in them for the last while, you know, as things like old draperies and stuff, you know, and butchers, they close down, unfortunately, one at a time, very often family businesses, and like the next generation of the business of the family, like, don't see a livelihood in it for them, so they move on to do something else. But with remote work, we feel that those people who don't want to move away from those towns and villages now have the opportunity to stay. And I suppose that brings us to a thing like, you know, why was urbanization the thing? And it was because, like, in many towns and villages and rural areas, people said, sure, there's no jobs around here. But that is simply not true anymore. We know that there is at least 80,000, which seems a huge number, but sorry, my screen is jumping a little bit there. We see that we know that there's at least 80,000 jobs available, remote jobs, fully remote jobs available in Ireland right now. So they're not all Irish companies. They're companies, many internationally, who are hiring either in our time zone or in the EU, or maybe in the EMEA, that'd be like the European, Africa, Middle East area. A lot of these large companies don't care where the people are as long as they're available to work at a certain time. But there's no reason that a large number of these jobs can't be drawn down in Ireland. So, for example, Hop-In, headquartered in Holland, fastest growing fully remote company in Europe at the moment. But per head of population, more of those jobs are landing in Ireland than in any other country. You know, so we're doing something right, and there's quite a lot of that, and I do have to acknowledge the work that, you know, the government are doing. We've brought in some policies. We've brought they're like of the right to request remote work, the right to disconnect. So we're, even though all those things mightn't be perfect, Ireland is a step ahead of a number of jurisdictions in terms of developing the ecosystem to make this work. You know, and we think there's a huge opportunity. So just a little bit more about, sorry, my screen is frozen here. A little bit more about those jobs. So Shopify, the people may or may not know this, Shopify is the largest remote employer, fully remote employer, no offices, but they employ over 400 people. They're dotted all over the country. Scraping Hub changed its name recently. That's Ireland's largest homegrown, fully remote company. They're now known as Zeit. And again, these are companies that people might know of, but there's several countries or companies out there that are hiring all the time. And what's really interesting about this is, like, remote companies don't need to advertise in a traditional manner. You'll never see, you know, a fully remote job with a fully remote company advertised in your local newspaper or your local radio, or maybe on the notice board in your local spar, where people used to, you know, traditionally go to find jobs. So at Grow Remote, that's one of the things we do. We try and find all these jobs and bring them into one place. We have a careers board on our website, or a jobs board, where all these jobs are advertised freely. Because what happens then is, when one or two people in the community get a job, they start telling others, well, there's other vacancies in our companies. Shopify or Automatic, or these companies that you may not have heard of, like, are hiring again. We know eBay, for example, probably one of the best known companies on that list. They're hiring regularly. They have loads of entry-level positions. In around entry level, when I say it's a 30 grand job, you get your annual leave, you get your health insurance, you get lots of other benefits that people don't know. You can get this quality job like in any community in Ireland. People, like, historically had to move to the cities to access those opportunities. I'll give you one example of Valencia Island. We had a chapter in Valencia Island, and where, again, bringing remote workers together, telling people a little bit about remote work. And on the other hand, we were working with a company based in Dublin to transition to remote. It was a non-profit organization, always office-based. Because of the pandemic, they had to begin transition to remote. So they advertised some of their jobs on our jobs board. The chapter in Valencia saw it, so that there's now somebody who's working, you know, for a Dublin-based company in Valencia, never has to travel unless they wanted to meet their colleagues, which is always recommended, but not too often. We can talk about hybrid, but that's another day's work. But that woman, Marie is her name, she was saying, like, there used to be a saying on Valencia Island where people used to fatten their kids for export, the same as the cattle, and they just don't do that anymore. Like, it has changed. Valencia Island, and I know another island up in Mayo Arnmore, have attracted enough of people to their islands to, like, to stop the depletion of the school, so they can keep 2 teachers instead of just having 1, which was the trajectory they were on only a couple of years ago. So this is just some of the stuff that we, like, some of the examples why we believe remote working is so powerful. I haven't been keeping an eye on the time, so if somebody wants to give me a wave if I'm going over, Sarah, please do. Am I over time? I am. Okay,
yeah,
so
you can have a couple more minutes. Go on.
Okay, and I'll just take 30 seconds on this slide. This slide is basically how we summarize what we're trying to achieve. It's our theory of change. You'll see on the right-hand side there, where all our work is trying to help people to live and work wherever they want. And also that when they do that, the communities they live and work in become more sustainable socially and economically. How are we doing that? By increasing the volume of remote work. And to do that, we work simply on the supply and demand side of that equation. We work with companies to try and increase the supply of remote jobs, and we work with individuals, you know, to get them remote ready so they can access those jobs. Again, I could keep talking. Thanks a million for inviting me along, and I looking forward to some conversation and questions after. Thanks a million.
Thanks, John. That was really interesting, particularly how undeveloped the sector is and the potential that there is for growth. I think, you know, the EU remote job stat that you had that shows that this is growing by 8 to 10%, this sector every 2 months is phenomenal. It's really shown the trajectory of where this is going and how it can bring about change and the effects that you said, not only on the rest of society, but the jobs that those remote workers create by sustaining coffee shops and people working in supermarkets, but also the education sector and the schools in those remote villages as well. I think it's fascinating to see the ripple effect that you referred to there. So hopefully there'll be some great questions for you coming through in the chat that we'll pick up on later. So yeah, feel free to drop those on, and we're going to move on to our next speaker now. We have Stephen Wall, who is an architect, a researcher, an educator, and illustrator, who recently returned to academia after a decade in practice. And during his master's, he won the Young Urbanist Prize in 2021. He now works in the Building in a Climate Emergency research group at UCD, and he's particularly interested in the impacts of the low carbon transition on Irish towns. He's going to talk to us today about the co-benefits of co-working spaces.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm just going to share my screen here. Now, is that full screen for you? Yeah. Okay, so guys, I was lucky enough to be one of the very first cohorts to do the UCD Masters in Architecture, Urbanism and Climate Action beginning in 2020. This is a new master's program that's being coordinated by Oliver Canaan and Philip Crowe, who you might know from the Centre for Irish Towns. And my thesis was supervised by Dr. Crowe. Sorry, I'm just adjusting my screen here for a second. Okay, so I was very interested in some of the points that John raised about the potential of remote work and its potential impact on Irish towns, in particular from not only from a social point of view, which John described, but also from an urban and environmental point of view, and especially in relation to co-working hubs, which have begun to spring up all over the country. Now, co-working hubs are intended for remote workers or for self-employed even. They provide the social, technological and networking advantages of an office without people having to travel to their employer office if they indeed are working remotely. They have the potential to have great urban impacts. They can reuse vacant retail or historic buildings, and they have the potential to liberate workers to work in any geographical location of their choice. However, it occurred to me that the location of the hubs is very important in terms of the potential benefits they can give to their communities. So, for example, on the left you have a centrally located co-working space in Boyle, County Roscommon, and on the right a very peripheral co-working space on the very outskirts of Kells. Now, the one on the right generates a sort of car-dependent user base. It misses opportunities, I think, to contribute to the economy locally with workers, popping out for lunch or something. It's just too remote. So my hypothesis was that the location of the co-working hub can actually dictate how much benefit it can give to the local community. So I set out to identify the full range of co-benefits that a successful co-working space can give to its location. And also if I could find some strategies and policy and management strategies to encourage these co-benefits to occur. My policy review revealed that the Irish government is very enthusiastic about co-working spaces for a lot of the reasons that John was talking about. The Irish government believes that co-working spaces can increase participation in the labour force, retain rural populations, and assist the transition to the low-carbon economy. And their policies, including Our Rural Future, set out to establish rights for co-workers and remote workers, tax supports, and they intend to create a network of over 400 hubs with a central booking website, which has been established and is now live, connectedhubs.ie. I set out to investigate the impact of these hubs with two strands of investigation. One was a survey of co-working space users. And for those, I intended to investigate their travel patterns, their spending patterns, and their living patterns to see how beneficial they were to the host communities. And the semi-structured interviews of managers, owners, operators, and founders of co-working spaces to see their on-the-ground experience of how these spaces are working. So some of the results, quite interesting. So in terms of the survey, 64% identified their hub as a centrally located hub, and 36% identified their hub as a peripheral located hub. The co-workers themselves were a mixture of self-employed, remote workers, and people who operated businesses out of the hubs. Now, in terms of residential location, 12% of the respondents reported that they were enabled to relocate to their current place of residence thanks to the existence of the co-working space. So this reinforces the idea that remote work can reinvigorate rural populations. Similarly, about 10% felt that they would feel pressure to leave their place of residence if the co-working space didn't exist. So it is having an impact on people's choice of residential locations, much to the benefit of small towns. When it comes to travel patterns, I discovered that the average co-worker travels to work less frequently than the average person, according to Census 2016. However, the centrally located co-workers travel to work by car much less than the average person, whereas the peripherally located co-working spaces actually travel to their workplace by car more often than the average person. So again, the location of the co-working space is really key to generate active and smart travel patterns among users. In terms of economic impact, the workers who worked in the centrally located spaces were found to more often visit cultural and recreational events between leaving work and arriving at home. So for example, going to the cinema, going to a restaurant, cafe, or even an educational or cultural event. The frequency with which they did those activities was much higher for the ones who worked in a centrally located space. So I moved on to the interviews, and I discovered that there were several motivations for starting spaces, and these kind of broke down fairly neatly between spaces that were established by private individuals and publicly funded spaces. The private individuals often had experienced co-working spaces abroad internationally and wanted to bring that sort of lifestyle to Ireland. So they were looking for central locations, charismatic buildings, protected structures even, and a certain lifestyle around working, having a glass of wine by the waterfront, that kind of thing. The public spaces were much more keen to have space to expand. They were interested in having car parking available, and they were often co-located with enterprise centers. So they tended to end up more peripheral. So I identified a range of co-benefits, dividing them between urban, social, and environmental. So some of the community events, for example, a lot of the co-working spaces are made available to community groups, either for a minimum fee or even free of charge. Almost all the co-working spaces did so. And these events, the community events, could vary from just as simple as a desk for a student who wasn't able to study at home, to art exhibitions, coder dojo events for teenagers, guest lectures, seminars, art, political questions and answers sessions, things like that. So a really interesting input into the vitality of the local community. I went on to generate a hierarchy of impacts that a co-working space could sort of aim at. So for example, an entry-level co-benefit would be to generate economic activity. So you locate your co-working space in the center of town, and peripheral businesses around you will see increased footfall. Then a more ambitious aim would be to reuse a historic or vacant building. As John was saying, there's a lot of vacancy around Ireland, and co-working spaces can help fill those buildings. And then the most advanced one would be to have your hub as a hub for the local economy, which could involve becoming a business incubator, having perhaps own-door offices available to your co-workers, fabrication labs, advanced items like that to stimulate enterprise. So a very key sort of inspiration for me was to, and has been in my academic work, is to make sure that the ideas that we're studying are kind of accessible to the general public. So I created, as part of the thesis, a booklet, a hypothetical publication from an organization called Irish Towns Partnership, which is inspired by the Scottish equivalent, Scotland's Towns Partnership, which is an NGO body in Scotland that coordinates town planning and reinvigoration. So this document is intended for to explain the benefits, the co-benefits of co-working to public representatives, community groups, entrepreneurs, operators, people considering establishing their own co-working space, or even just curious members of the public. And it graphically illustrates here some of the benefits that I've described. So you can see a hypothetical co-working space in the center, established in perhaps a former bank building. It's using solar panels to create a low energy working environment. It's located close to public transport and active travel options. In terms of urban impacts, it's providing business activity for neighboring cafes and so on. And it's also offering community benefits, social benefits, like offering community groups and social clubs low-cost meeting spaces for out-of-hours meetings and so on. So you can see an enormous range of benefits that are over and above the basic benefit, which is a valid workspace, a viable workspace for remote workers and people who are working remotely in this town. And then finally, the publication ends with just a simplified version of my co-benefits diagram and a little bit of advice for anyone who's considering operating or establishing one of these, just to lay out the benefits of mostly of the location, but also the nature of how you manage a co-working space to optimize the chances that these co-benefits will occur. So thank you very much, everybody. Very happy to take some questions.
Perfectly timed there, Stephen. Thanks for that. So I think we'll go straight into the questions there. I can see that there's a few that have come through. So if all of the speakers can unmute themselves, and I'll come through the questions as and when they're coming in. So the first one is for Orla. It's come from Philip Crow. Has there been much research into business improvement districts in Ireland? He says, as far as he's aware, there are only a handful in Ireland, both in Sligo and Dundalk. But there's over 40 in Scotland. They might be considered to have a role in the resilience of small businesses in towns of a certain size.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Philip. Good question. I'm not that I'm aware of, I have to say. It's certainly not a research stream of mine. But I think what's interesting about the business, the BIDs, is that it's businesses coming together, developing those proposals and getting approval or recognition as a business improvement district. So I think there is scope for greater networking and community building amongst businesses themselves as well. So yeah, I'm not quite sure why they mightn't be as successful or have taken off to the same degree here as the UK.
Thanks, Orla. I don't know if there's anything that the other two speakers want to jump in on that. If not, I'll go on to the next one. The next one's a question for you, John, from Orla Murphy, who's asking, is there any research that compares the benefits of fully remote versus hybrid working for both employers and employees? And this seems to be one of the challenges companies are facing post-COVID.
So I don't have a straight answer for that, but yes, there is research, but I think there's almost too much research out there doing it, like as endless surveys of companies and employers and employees, and like a little deeper analysis of a lot of that research kind of shows that like people are coming to this with a perspective. So obviously people who are involved in real estate in cities want people to go back to the office. People who are involved in companies like who sell tools for remote work want people to stay remote. So it's hard enough to dive in to actually find out what's the truth and all of that, to be honest. You know, but there is more and more evidence is like that. Like going back to the office full time is kind of off the cards for lots of people. Like the genie is out of the bottle and people don't want to travel, and really interested in listening to Stephen, like, you know, all the additional benefits such as environmental benefits, which we probably don't talk enough about, you know, are really, really important. So like the big question marks, I think, for employers is around things like collaboration and innovation and like the importance of bringing people together. And we'd agree people need to be brought together at certain times, but it needs to be done strategically. But one kind of counterpoint to that is I think where companies have been relying on the accidental connection, like over coffee or at the water cooler, for their collaboration or innovation, means they're probably not doing something right. They need to be more intentional about that. So there's lots of surveys in all Orla, but like nothing that I'd be standing over to point you towards.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, John. We've got loads of questions flying in, so I'm going to just try and get through as many of them as we can. This next one's for Stephen, asking, did you collect information on what was on offer in the co-working spaces, things like canteens or coffee ducks? And did you link this to the level of economic activity that took place? So if there were fewer people leaving a space, if there was a canteen there, for example, so in terms of the economic impacts that might have in the town itself.
Yes, I did collect information on facilities within the co-working spaces. I actually concentrated on facilities to do with active travel. So whether there were shower facilities, whether there were locker facilities and so on. And I considered that in terms of whether people drove or whether they walked and cycled to work. And I found that most of the co-working spaces actually were considering installing those active travel facilities, even if they hadn't got them already. So they were conscious that only one of the co-working spaces I spoke to was worried about being sued by someone falling in a shower. So he was absolutely adamantly not having it. And I also collected some information on whether there was a kitchenette. Basically, 100% of the co-working spaces had access to a kitchen and coffee docks. So it didn't really impact on whether or not they wanted to pop out for lunch. It was much more dependent on whether the space was peripheral or centrally located.
Fantastic, that's great. And I guess also, although all of them had them, I guess there's going to be variation in the quality of the facilities that are on offer there, and how that might influence whether or not people are leaving or staying.
Well, it would certainly be worth doing a little more thinking into the quality of the space, which I didn't go into in a lot of detail, but yes, it could correlate, yeah.
So we now have a question for John again, which is, do we know the percentage of privately run co-working vis-a-vis publicly provided space?
Yeah, again, so unfortunately, I don't have a straight answer for this either. I know that there was, in the larger towns, there's a lot of privately run co-working spaces that would have had a sustainable business model. Even before COVID, and obviously COVID has progressed that. I wouldn't quite call them publicly provided, but I know that there's been a huge increase in the number of kind of locally owned non-profit organizations with support from the different government departments to help make them work. And in total, like via the Connected Hubs network, I think that there's a few hundred hubs on that, or co-working spaces on that platform right now, but it's aiming towards 400 across the country when they're all set up and running. And I suppose there is a question mark about can all of those be sustainable as like from a financial or an economic perspective without ongoing government support in their own right. I think that remains to be seen.
Yeah. Karen has a question for Stephen, I think here. Really important implications for planning and locating spaces in appropriate places. Are there challenges getting access to potential spaces due to private ownership of, say, for example, vacant buildings that would be within town centres?
Well, it's a good question. There's so many vacant buildings in town centres, and a lot of my work was inspired by a report that Philip Crowe from the Centre of Irish Towns produced, a Town Centre Living Initiative report, which set out to identify why there's so many vacant spaces and why they're not in use. And among other problems, there's often grey areas about ownership of these spaces. They might have been inherited by several parties, and there's a sort of legal issues about who actually owns it, who has the right to sell it, and so on. The hubs I spoke to generally were able to access buildings because they already owned them, or because they became aware that they were available. So is there a challenge to it? Not insurmountable, I would say, but there is a challenge in operating a hub from a protected structure, especially. It's extremely expensive. Even things like changing windows becomes exorbitantly more expensive than doing it in a non-protected structure. So the hubs I spoke to who were operating out of them, they admitted that their co-workers loved the charismatic building, but they were exhausted with trying to maintain it, and very keen that the government might actually fund specifically hubs in protected structures and historic buildings to encourage that co-benefit to exist. Okay.
Yeah, this looks like it's a question for anyone to come in on. Have there been any studies concerning the performance levels of workers and micro companies based in town centre hubs versus those in hubs located on the edge of towns? So does it affect the performance levels of the workers and the company as a whole?
Very good question, but I haven't come across any studies that would have dealt with that issue. No. My instinct would be it would be good for morale to be able to pop out and have a quick coffee, and your productivity would increase. But perhaps that could be a distraction as well. I'm not sure. I haven't come across any studies.
Particularly, I suppose, depending on some of the other benefits that you referred to as well, the wider social, economic, environmental things. Again, that might impact on well-being and time saved in commute if you're not having to get into your car and it's somewhere that is walking distance from where you're living. Again, all of these things could be having an influence. John, Orla, is there anything to add on that? Or no?
Not that I'm aware of,
no, I wouldn't be very well informed on that, but I'm really interested in the good questions that have been asked that we'll have to go and find the answers to.
So I have another question for you here, Stephen. We're keeping you on your toes with all of the questions, but in your research, did you unearth an optimal size for a co-working space?
Well, no, I don't think there is an optimal size, and it kind of boils down to what the motivation of the owner of a co-working space is. So, and this is absolutely fascinating. Some people found themselves, like that example in Roscommon, where you have a building that was previously a factory. What do you do with it? Well, if you're very ambitious, you can turn it into a very, very large co-working space. Now, it's hard, as John says, to make this economically viable, and all of the co-working spaces were struggling a little bit with economic viability. But on the other hand, I had interviewees who had a little cafe in a village, and they simply opened the upstairs room, first floor room, as a co-working space because they themselves wanted to have a nice place to work. And then they were able to fit in 3 or 4 extra desks and make a little money from it. So it's not one size fits all. It can work from 5 desks to 500. So yeah, not by any means an optimal size, but it depends on, I guess, your business model and your motivation for opening the space.
So there's just a comment here that it's very interesting work, and it's particularly of use to local authorities that are applying for funding for these co-working spaces. There's a question now for John, which is there a magic list of the companies that seek remote workers apart from those that you mentioned?
Not a magic list, but we do our best. We have on our website, growremote.ie, there's a careers board where we have several hundred jobs at the minute for remote only jobs that we put up there. That list is always expanding because, like, one of the big tasks we're tackling is helping companies to transition to remote that weren't traditionally remote. So ideally, even companies that don't hire only remote people will start hiring some remote people. And when I say remote people, it's the jobs that are remote. So we want big, well-known Irish companies such as a mainstream bank or the ESB or Vodafone to advertise jobs without location. So you can work for these companies while living on one of the islands or in a small town, and you don't have to move to the city. But do visit our website I can stick it into the chat there myself, where the companies and the jobs that we know that are available at the minute.
Great. I think that might be all of the questions that we had through on the chat now. So I was just going to give each of the speakers a last chance to just add something in, I suppose a takeaway in terms of how transformative you think some of these things can be, remote working, co-working spaces, incentivizing small businesses to actually take hold in towns. How transformative do you think it can be for the revitalization of our towns? And what would be, I suppose, the key barrier to overcome to make this really widespread? We'll go to you first, Orla.
Yeah, good question, Sarah. I think it just helps build a really strong ecosystem for the towns and communities and everybody in them. And my angle on that is towards the small business owners. So I think what Stephen mentioned, the coffee shop, people who had the coffee shop and opened the space upstairs, you know, they're employers, they're employing themselves, they may employ other people on a part-time basis. If other people rent space from them, generates income from them, maybe they can employ others, maybe they can expand the business into something else or buy a new product range. So all of this just contributes back to the point I was making about 10 euros spent in your local area generates an extra 40. So it's the multiplier effect, and we're not going to get that unless we have the infrastructure. So I strongly, I echo everything the guys were saying and think it all helps build that stronger ecosystem.
So you would say, I suppose, infrastructure is one of the biggest barriers then in making this a reality, widespread. Yeah. Stephen, John, anything last to add in?
Well, I just reiterate that if these, first of all, I think this remote working and co-working hubs have a transformative potential for towns and cities, and my conclusion is the government is quite right to have supportive policies for them. But what I would contribute to that discussion is that people should resist the temptation to locate peripherally unless they actually have to. You know, you might lose a few car parking spaces, but locating in the town centre will maximize all those range of co-benefits, which are many, you know. So get the location right, get the management strategies right, and it should really assist the town in a whole host of ways.
Thanks, Stephen. John, anything to add?
Yeah, just to wrap up again, I think it's been a fascinating conversation, and I've learned a lot from Orla and Stephen, and just looking at the kind of the, you know, synchronicity of the three kind of approaches to the one problem. It really, you know, indicates that the more joined up thinking and the joined up action to follow that thinking to make, you know, to fulfill, I suppose, the potential that's there right now, because I think we all know the country and the world as a whole is going under transformation of how we live and work. And we have an opportunity to make it work really well for everybody and for people, planet and profit. So I think there's a lot to be learned for the conversation, and thanks again.
So on that note, I'd just like to thank all of our speakers and all of the attendees for their great questions, for the wonderful presentations that we had from the three speakers. And I really hope that we will see some of you again when we have the next flush of our seminars, which will start up again in the autumn term. So this is the last one for the year, but we will be starting back hopefully with a new exciting international collaboration. So keep your ear to Twitter and all of the CFIT communications to see when we're back up and running again. Thanks again.